teach Anatomy and Physiology 1 and 2, and as you can imagine, these classes are heavy laden with facts and materials and information and a lot of memorization. And so early on in the semesters, I often see my students just becoming overwhelmed with the amount of material or the fast pace of the course. And so I really have tried to work in a way that prevents them from falling into that trap of asking the questions, well, what do I really need to know for the test? Is that going to be on the test? And many students, they get caught up in that. Just tell me what I need. I've got to make a good grade. I look out and I just see them really becoming more and more overwhelmed. And so my teaching tip really has to do with how to make make a transition from all of the material, the data, the information that they have to learn and they have to memorize, and move towards why they have to memorize that so that they can ultimately apply that. And especially if they're going to be a nurse or they want to help people, I try to make that real to them ultimately. A couple of examples of when I might use this in class. Early on, the first couple of weeks, we learn a lot of different terms for body regions. And there are a lot of these terms when you think of the front of the body and the back of the body and all the different parts, the arms, the legs, the hands. As well as we talk about directional sense with the body. And so just in one lesson, they have a lot of information. And so after we've done that, and I can tell that they're looking sort of glassy-eyed and just thinking, how am I ever going to learn all of that? Maybe the next day we come back, or when we come back for lecture. Let me also say that I have early morning classes, and so many of my students come in barely awake. And so I really want to get them moving. I want to get them awake. I want to get their blood flowing so that they're thinking well and clearly. And we will do an activity. So for this specific learning of these body regions, we'll play a game like Simon Says. So we get in a circle so that we can look at each other and hopefully laugh with each other. And I will start calling out pretty quickly these body parts, and I'm giving them a whole lot of terms. So I may tell them that with their right distal third phalanx to touch their contralateral proximal antebrachial region. And so they're having to think through this and process, along with, did Simon say to do it? Then what's a phalanx? And then what does contralateral mean again? I don't remember. And then proximal versus distal, and they've got to think through that. And what was the antebrachial? Where am I touching over here? And so we get to laugh and have fun doing that. So they're having to process it, and it's not just words on a page. But at the same time, I'm also hopefully using movement and working sort of kinesthetically and giving them an image as they look across the way at someone else do it, and they're actually using their body part to touch and feel. I'm hoping that I'm making it a little bit easier to learn rather than sitting the night before the test with their sheet of paper memorizing a bunch of facts. I also do some different activities like this when we're using some sort of bigger concepts. It's easy to see a body part, but when you're talking about these sort of microscopic ideas, it can be much harder for some students to visualize that. And so when we, for example, talk about in the muscular system, we talk about the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. And that can just be this sort of ethereal idea that's somewhere up here out floating in space that some of the students just really struggle with. And so one of the things I like to do is I divide the class after we've explained it, I've talked through it, had them read about it. I divide the class in two, and I tell them that they're going to have to be able to explain that model. And they're going to have to act it out. And I don't really care how they act it out. I don't give them, say, this is what you're going to do. I let them be creative and work together as teams to do this. But I'm going to grade them and decide which team does the best. And so to get them to buy into this, I tell them it's worth 2 bonus points on their exam. And all you have to say is 2 bonus points, and they're ready to do this. So I'm able to really assess, do kind of a visual assessment while they're actually learning it better, and that way I can maybe meet with some of these students, or I can determine I'm going to have to spend some more time on this. And then when they do their acting out, I can hear, do they really understand at the depth that I need them to understand this concept, or has this been really glossed over and I need to go back and revisit this? And so that would be kind of another example of an activity that I might use, ultimately trying to get them towards not just memorizing something on a page. And then finally, in doing all of this, I always ask the question, so what and who cares anyway? And I try to, whatever the material is, whatever chapter on, whatever system that we're on, after we've talked through some of the basic information, I try to use some sort of real life example where we can critically think through an actual problem with a patient and how we would apply and use all of this information that we've just learned in a real life scenario. And since most of my students, they have empathy towards their patients, they think about this and they're like, oh, I do need to know this material. So they get out of that, just tell me what I have to know for the exam. And now they're able to move towards, I really need to know this material because it's important. I'm going to be in a position where I need to be able to think through all this material to come up with the answers to help this person. And that's ultimately what I try to do, is to have some real live critical thinking type questions with patient scenarios, athlete scenarios, to get them more involved and interested, and not be held down, stuck in the quagmire of information that can be so overwhelming in anatomy and physiology. So my question then is, across campus, you maybe don't teach a science or A&P. How do you use this in English, or how do you use this in history? And so I was just thinking about, it really doesn't matter. You may not have a patient scenario, but you're in any class you teach will be able to go from all the memorized information material and move towards the application of the material in a different way that helps them think through and really apply everything that you're trying to teach them, so that if they can understand why they need to know, it makes the learning the material a lot more fun and digestible, I think.